Ethan Caldwell's life had always been an orchestra of awkwardness, punctuated by the occasional cymbal crash of brilliance. Standing in the middle of his modest genetics lab, housed inside an unassuming smoothie shop downtown, he raised a plastic cup of birthday-themed protein shake to a small gathering of colleagues. To evolution, he announced, grinning wide. Or, as I like to call it, the awkward teenager phase of life. Because, honestly, if evolution were a person, it would still have braces and a bad haircut. The room chuckled half-heartedly. Ethan wasn't surprised. Jokes about genetic mutation rarely landed with the same crowd twice. His friends and colleagues, mostly young researchers who had somehow found the intersection of enthusiasm and caffeine dependency, were used to his antics. Seriously, though, he said, sobering slightly. What we're doing here could change everything. And it could. Ethan's project, aptly named Project Homo Novus, was a bold leap into the unknown. By activating dormant genes buried deep in human DNA, he aimed to push the boundaries of evolution, no more waiting millions of years for natural selection to get its act together. He wanted to fast-forward the tape. As the night wore on, the party dwindled, leaving only Ethan and his closest colleague, Dr. Mia Lopez. She was his sounding board, his reality check, and the only one who could make sense of his barely legible lab notes. Are you sure you're ready for this? Mia asked, her brow furrowing as she eyed the equipment humming softly in the corner. Ready? Ethan grinned. I was born ready. Well, technically, I was born screaming and covered in goo, but you get the idea. Mia rolled her eyes. You know this could backfire, right? The human genome isn't a light switch. You can't just flip it on and off without consequences. And yet, Ethan said, walking to the console and typing a few commands, that's exactly what I plan to do. The equipment roared to life. Ethan's experiment wasn't some Hollywood contraption with flashing lights and dramatic sparks. It was more subdued, rows of glowing tubes, soft beeping, and the occasional whir of a cooling fan. But the implications were no less monumental. I'll be fine, he said, stepping into the containment chamber. What's the worst that could happen? The worst, as it turned out, was both hilarious and horrifying. When Ethan woke up the next morning, the first thing he noticed was the sunlight streaming through his window. It was loud. That was the only way to describe it. The golden beams didn't just illuminate the room, they seemed to sing, a symphony of warmth and energy that vibrated in his bones. Blinking, he sat up and rubbed his eyes. His skin felt strange, like it was buzzing faintly, and the light didn't hurt his eyes. It felt good, like drinking hot cocoa on a snowy day. He stumbled to the bathroom, half expecting to see himself with a glowing halo or sprouting feathers. What he saw was almost worse. His reflection stared back at him with wide, unnerved eyes. His skin, though still his usual pale shade, shimmered faintly, as though dusted with microscopic stars. His pupils had elongated slightly, cat-like, and his hair seemed darker, richer, as if each strand had been painted with the deep hues of a storm cloud. Okay, he whispered to himself, gripping the sink. Not ideal. As the day progressed, things only got weirder. He could smell colors, yes, smell them. The coffee his neighbor brewed every morning now carried a faint swirl of brown, earthy warmth. The park down the street called to him with a kaleidoscope of green and yellow scents that made his mouth water, and then there was the whispering. At first, he thought it was his phone. Then the TV. Then maybe his sleep-deprived imagination. But no, the voices weren't electronic or figments of his subconscious. They were coming from the potted fern in his living room. Finally awake, huh? It said, its voice dry and crackling, like leaves crunching underfoot. Ethan froze, staring at the plant. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the fact that the fern was talking, or the fact that it sounded exactly like his old high school gym teacher. I'm hallucinating, Ethan muttered, backing away. This is a side effect. It has to be. Side effect? The fern rustled indignantly. You're the one who played God, buddy. Don't come crying to me now. By the time Ethan made it to the lab, he was practically vibrating with nervous energy. Mia took one look at him and nearly dropped her coffee. "What the hell happened to you?" she demanded, grabbing his arm and turning it over to inspect his glowing skin. "Oh, you know," Ethan said, trying for nonchalance. "Just a little evolution. Nothing to worry about." "Nothing to worry about?" Mia's voice rose an octave. "Ethan, you look like a glow stick at a rave." "It's fine," he said quickly. This is just phase 1. Phase 1? Mia's eyes widened. "Ethan, what did you do to yourself?" He hesitated. Explaining it would only make it sound worse, but there was no avoiding it. "I activated the PX6 and HAR1F genes in my DNA," he said. "They're linked to evolutionary development. I just gave them a little nudge." "A little nudge?" Mia looked like she wanted to strangle him. "Ethan, those genes control things like brain development and sensory perception. You could have triggered." Yeah, I know," he interrupted. "But look, I'm fine. Mostly. I mean, I might be hearing plants, but that's probably just temporary, right?" Mia stared at him, her face a mixture of disbelief and exasperation. "You're hearing plants?" "Only the sarcastic ones," Ethan said, shrugging. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan's transformation deepened. His glowing skin dimmed slightly, blending into something more subtle, but his other abilities only grew stronger. He could sense the weather shifting hours before it happened. He didn't need food or sleep. Sunlight seemed to power him like a solar battery. The whispers of plants turned into full conversations. Trees shared ancient secrets, grass complained about being trampled, and flowers flirted shamelessly. Ethan learned to tune them out, though their chatter sometimes broke through in quiet moments, like an annoying radio station he couldn't quite turn off. But the changes weren't all whimsical. There was a darker edge to his newfound abilities, a sense that he was becoming something other than human. He no longer felt hunger, but he also no longer craved the comforts of a warm meal or the taste of coffee. His senses, though extraordinary, alienated him from the people around him. Their laughter sounded too loud, their scents overwhelming, their movements sluggish and clumsy compared to his. Mia, ever the pragmatist, tried to help him navigate his new reality. She set up controlled experiments, documenting his abilities and searching for a way to reverse the transformation. But the more she studied him, the more Ethan felt like a specimen under a microscope. "I'm still me," he said one evening, as Mia scanned his brainwaves for the umpteenth time. "Aren't I?" She didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice soft. "You're different. But that doesn't mean you're not you." He wanted to believe her. But deep down, a nagging doubt gnawed at him. If his body and mind were changing, if his very biology was rewriting itself, how could he be sure he was still the same person he'd always been? The answer, he feared, was that he couldn't. Ethan couldn't sleep that night, not that he needed to anymore. Instead, he lay on his couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the subtle hum of the world outside. The city breathed in patterns he could now understand, the rhythmic thrum of traffic, the faint vibrations of subway trains, the wind brushing against buildings. It all blended into a living organism, intricate and alive in ways he'd never perceived before. For most people, such clarity might have been awe-inspiring. For Ethan, it was exhausting. That he stood and walked to the window, drawn by the faint golden light of the moon. The air felt electric against his skin, and he closed his eyes, letting it flow over him. He could sense every plant in the tiny park across the street, their roots stretching deep into the soil, their leaves trembling in the breeze. He wondered, not for the first time, if he was losing his mind. The thought was interrupted by the buzzing of his phone. He glanced at the screen and saw Mia's name. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, answering with a weary smile. "More like I'm afraid to," Mia said. "We need to talk, Ethan." "Sure. I mean, it's not like I'm counting sheep over here. Not over the phone. Come to the lab." Ethan hesitated. He hadn't been back to the lab in days, not since the last round of tests had left him feeling more like a curiosity than a person. But Mia's voice carried an urgency he couldn't ignore. "I'll be there in 20, he said, already pulling on his jacket. The city at night was quieter than usual, or maybe it just seemed that way to him now. The hum of streetlights, the soft scuff of footsteps on pavement, the faint whispers of the wind, they all blended into a low melody that made him feel like he was walking through a dream. When he arrived at the lab, Mia was waiting for him by the door. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, but her expression was determined. "What's going on?" Ethan asked as she led him inside. "I've been running simulations," Mia said, her voice clipped. "Trying to map out the trajectory of your genetic changes." "And?" She stopped in front of a monitor, gesturing for him to look. The screen displayed a graph with a steep upward curve, dotted with clusters of data points. "This is your current rate of mutation," she said. "It's accelerating." Ethan frowned. "Accelerating how?" "Your DNA isn't just rewriting itself, it's adapting," Mia said. "It's responding to environmental stimuli, integrating new information at an exponential rate. It's like you're evolving in real time." He stared at the screen, his unease growing. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you're not stable," Mia said quietly. "Your body is in a constant state of flux. If it keeps going at this rate, I don't know if there's going to be anything left of the original you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd known, deep down, that he was changing in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. But hearing it laid out so starkly, so clinically, made it feel like a death sentence. "Is there a way to stop it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Mia admitted. "I've been trying to find a way to stabilize the mutations, but the process is too advanced. Every time I think I've isolated a variable, your DNA shifts again." Ethan took a step back, running a hand through his hair. His thoughts were a chaotic tangle of fear and frustration. He felt like a passenger in his own body, hurtling toward an unknown destination. "What if?" He paused, swallowing hard. "What if I'm not supposed to stop it?" Mia looked at him sharply. "What are you talking about?" "What if this is part of the process?" he said. "What if I'm evolving because I'm supposed to? Maybe this is what comes next." "That's ridiculous," Mia snapped. "You're a person, Ethan, not some prototype for a new species." "Am I, though?" he said, his voice rising. "Because I don't feel like one anymore. I don't sleep, I don't eat, I can't even have a normal conversation without feeling like I'm speaking a different language. Maybe I'm not human anymore. Maybe I'm something else." Mia opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the equipment. "I don't accept that," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You're still you, Ethan. We'll figure this out. We have to." But Ethan wasn't so sure. The days that followed were a blur of tests and tense conversations. Ethan submitted to Mia's scans and blood draws, hoping against hope that she would find something to anchor him. But with each passing day, he felt himself slipping further away from the life he'd known. His senses grew sharper, his perception broader. He could hear the faint hum of the Earth's magnetic field, feel the subtle pull of gravity like an invisible thread connecting him to the ground. He could predict rain hours before the first cloud appeared, sense the vibrations of insects moving through the grass, and then there were the pheromones. He discovered them by accident, during a chance encounter with a panicked dog outside his apartment building. The animal had been barking wildly, snapping at passers-by, until Ethan approached. As soon as he got close, the dog stopped, its body relaxing as if a switch had been flipped. The incident unnerved him, but it wasn't until he noticed similar reactions in people, strangers calming in his presence, an angry cashier suddenly softening her tone, that he realized the implications that he wasn't just different. He was dangerous. Mia tried to reassure him, insisting that his abilities could be controlled, but Ethan wasn't convinced. The more he changed, the more he felt like a threat to the people around him. It all came to a head one night when he overheard Mia on the phone with someone, her voice low and urgent, her words barely audible through the walls. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this under wraps," she was saying. He's not stable. We need to consider other options." Ethan didn't wait to hear the rest. He slipped out of the lab and into the night, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and betrayal. He wandered the city for hours, avoiding crowded streets and busy intersections. The neon lights and bustling noise felt like an assault on his heightened senses, but he couldn't bring himself to go home. He didn't know where he belonged anymore. Eventually, he found himself in a quiet park on the edge of town. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. For the first time in days, he felt a semblance of peace. Sitting beneath an old oak tree, he closed his eyes and let the sounds of the forest wash over him. The rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the soft murmurs of the wind, it all felt like a language he was only beginning to understand. "Is this what you wanted?" he whispered, not sure who he was talking to. "To make me this?" The tree didn't answer, but he felt its presence all the same, a deep, ancient awareness that seemed to hum beneath the surface of the bark. He pressed his hand against the rough trunk, and for a moment, he thought he could feel the slow, steady rhythm of its life force. He didn't know how long he sat there, but when he finally stood, he felt different. Calmer, more centered. Whatever was happening to him, he wasn't going to find answers in a lab. If he wanted to understand what he was becoming, he needed to go back to the source. He needed to leave the city. Ethan left the city at dawn, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the haze like golden threads unraveling the edges of the world. He didn't bother packing. What could he possibly need? Food had become irrelevant, and he hadn't felt the bite of cold or heat in weeks. His body seemed perfectly attuned to its surroundings now, as if every cell in him responded to the environment with fluid precision. The farther he drove, the lighter he felt. Skyscrapers gave way to suburban homes, then to rolling fields, and finally to untamed forests that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed space, distance, and quiet to make sense of what he was becoming. Hours later, his car skidded to a stop on a gravel road at the edge of a dense forest. He stepped out and stood for a moment, letting the cool air settle over him. The trees whispered softly, their voices laced with curiosity. He could feel the pulse of the forest beneath his feet, the life coursing through its roots like a vast, interconnected web. This was where he belonged, at least for now. The forest welcomed him in ways no human could. Animals approached without fear, deer with their liquid eyes, squirrels chittering inquisitively, birds alighting on nearby branches as if they knew him. He wandered deeper, letting the world around him guide his steps. His mind felt clearer here, unburdened by the chaos and noise of human life. As night fell, the air turned cool, but Ethan felt no discomfort. He found a patch of soft moss beneath a towering oak and sat, closing his eyes. The forest spoke to him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend but understood on an instinctive level. Its rhythms matched the strange new cadence of his being, syncing with his heartbeat, his breath, his thoughts. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, lost in the ebb and flow of the forest's energy, when a sudden, sharp sound broke through the stillness, a crack of a branch, heavy footsteps. He opened his eyes and rose to his feet, every sense on high alert. Someone was coming. A beam of light pierced the darkness, and he stepped back instinctively, blending into the shadows. Two figures emerged from the trees, their voices low but urgent. "You sure this is the place?" one of them asked. "Yes. He's here," the other replied. "The readings are off the charts." Ethan's chest tightened. He knew the voice. It was Mia. She was holding a small device, its screen glowing faintly in the dark. Beside her stood a man Ethan didn't recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, carrying something that looked disturbingly like a tranquilizer gun. They were close now, the beam of Mia's flashlight sweeping across the undergrowth. "Ethan," she called softly. "If you're here, please come out. I just want to talk." He stayed silent, his instincts urging him to retreat. Something wasn't right. Mia's presence should have been reassuring, but the man with her, the equipment, the urgency in her voice, it all felt wrong. I know you're scared," Mia continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But you're not safe out here. You need help." Ethan stepped back again, his foot brushing against a branch. The faint crack was enough to give him away. "There," the man barked, raising his weapon. Before Ethan could react, a sharp hiss cut through the air, and a dart embedded itself in the tree trunk inches from his head. Adrenaline surged through him, and he turned, bolting deeper into the forest. His body moved with unnatural speed and grace, his feet barely touching the ground as he weaved through the trees. Behind him, he could hear Mia shouting, the man crashing clumsily through the underbrush in pursuit. His mind raced, a storm of fear and anger and betrayal. Why had Mia brought someone here? What did they want from him? The forest seemed to sense his distress, its energy surging around him. Branches shifted, roots twisted, the path ahead clearing as if the trees themselves were guiding him. He ran until the sounds of his pursuers faded, then slowed, breathing heavily. He sank to the ground, his back against a massive tree trunk, and closed his eyes. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his heart. Then, slowly, the forest's whispers returned, soothing and steady. He let them wash over him, grounding him, but even as he calmed, a new thought began to take shape, one that filled him with a mix of dread and determination. He couldn't keep running. Sooner or later, they would find him again. And next time, he might not escape. If he wanted answers, if he wanted to understand what he was becoming, he needed to confront Mia. He needed to know the truth. The next morning, Ethan made his way back toward the edge of the forest. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns of light and shadow on the ground. His senses were sharper than ever, every sound and movement registering with crystal clarity. He could feel the forest around him, its energy humming in harmony with his own. When he reached the road where he'd left his car, Mia was waiting. She sat on the hood of her vehicle, her face pale and drawn, the device from the night before clutched tightly in her hands. She looked up as he approached, her eyes widening in relief. "Ethan," she said, standing quickly. "Thank God." Why are you here?" he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "What do you want from me?" Mia hesitated, glancing down at the device in her hands. "I'm trying to help you," she said finally. "You're changing so quickly, and I don't know how much longer you'll be stable. I brought someone who could what?" Ethan said, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Shoot me? Experiment on me? Turn me into a lab rat?" "No," Mia said quickly. "It wasn't like that. I didn't know what else to do. You're not safe out here, Ethan. You're not human," he finished for her, his voice bitter. Mia flinched but didn't deny it. "I didn't mean." "Yes, you did," Ethan said. "And maybe you're right. Maybe I'm not human anymore. But whatever I am, I don't need saving, not by you, not by anyone." Mia looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Ethan, please. I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me?" he said, his voice rising. "From what? From myself? From you?" "From them," she said, her voice breaking. "Do you think I'm the only one who knows about you? The company's already asking questions. The government won't be far behind. If they find you, they won't care about your humanity. They'll see you as a threat, something to contain, or eliminate." Ethan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He wanted to be angry, to push her away, but deep down, he knew she was right. He wasn't safe, not from the world, and not from himself. "I can't go back," he said quietly. "Not to the lab, not to the way things were. That part of my life is over." "Then what will you do?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked past her, toward the forest that had become his refuge. "I don't know," he said. "But I'll figure it out. Whatever I'm becoming, whatever I'm meant to be, I'll find my own way." Mia nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said. For everything. Ethan didn't respond. He turned and walked back into the forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees like a golden promise. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of purpose. The forest welcomed him back, its whispers steady and unchanging. He wasn't human anymore, but he wasn't alone. He was part of something bigger, something ancient and enduring, and as he disappeared into the trees, he knew that whatever the future held, he would face it on his own terms.